We are completed. Ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you on behalf of the United Nations Environment Programme here in Berlin today for the presentation of the Emissions Gap Report 2013. It's the fourth report now. The first Emissions Gap Report was launched in 2010. And this report is mainly done by the United Nations Environment Programme, by the UNEP. It's in this year also financed by the German Federal Ministry for Environment, among others. And this report is a status report what focus on the commitments for emissions mitigations of the individual states, the so-called Copenhagen pledges, and to the climate targets, mainly the 2-degree target. The report inspects how consistent are the commitments, like the Copenhagen pledges and other commitments with that climate targets, the mainly 2-degree target. This just short details for you. We will now present you the details of this current report here at the press conference. You have the press release, you have also the advanced report, and there's a synthesis report. You can find all that also on the website from the UNEP. We are also connected via web stream, so this press event is streamed on webcast on the UNEP website, and we have also the possibility to put questions to us via Twitter. So we are very well connected here. This report is also presented today in Brussels and Rio de Janeiro. Okay, now to the panel here. You see Achim Steiner, the executive director from the UNEP and UN Under Secretary General, and also his spokesman Nick Nuttall is here. And there is Joachim Flassberg, the president of the Federal Environment Agency, and both begin now to make the first part of the presentation, and I will highlight the importance of this GAP report. Mr. Steiner, we are very pleased to welcome you on Nairobi live via web stream. The web stream is fine. The floor is yours.
Thank you, and good morning to Berlin. Good morning. I see you in a very small box on my screen, but you can hear me loud and clear. I would like to thank the Pressekonferenz, also my colleagues of the Plasbad and who are on the panel this morning for being available. We're launching today a report that is a series of reports that we have begun to produce every year to try and enable the world to take stock of how well we are doing in terms of the pledges that we have made and the targets that we have agreed we would measure ourselves against. I would like to emphasize that the Emissions Gap Report is, in a sense, a service to the international community that tries to draw together many different centers of expertise around the world that are engaged in climate modeling, in observing emissions, in data management, and in that sense an attempt to synthesize to the best of our knowledge and available information where we are in terms of the emissions gap that we have already for a number of years begun to chart out in terms of where we are in terms of what's happening right now, what the projections will be towards 2020 of where we will be in terms of emissions, and where we need to be in terms of the 2-degree target. As I mentioned, 44 scientific centers in 17 countries participate in this emissions gap report. It is our best attempt to try to present to the world this analysis, and we are very reassured that over the last 2 or 3 years, the models and also the estimates are holding up very well, which seems to reinforce that I think the overall view of data that is available and our ability to track is holding. The bad news is that where we are right now does reinforce the fundamental notion and also impression that is being conveyed by many of the reports around the world, by many of the experts, window of opportunity of trying to meet this 2-degree target threshold is in a sense becoming ever more elusive. Our report still makes the point that there are a number of pathways and tracks, and our colleagues will speak to that in a moment, with which we can achieve this. And let me also emphasize that in all this numbers game, what is important is that we are trying to document choices in terms of opportunities, but opportunity costs, as economists would call it. You can indeed sit back for another few years in your armchair and say, I'm not ready to act. And if I then have to act, well, we can still do it. We just have to do a lot more in a short period of time. I think this is where we have, in this emissions gap report, an opportunity to look at an ethical choice of the generation that today makes decisions, but expressing it also in terms of economic policy choices that will be made. Because what this report essentially says is that the window of opportunity from a pragmatic and realistic point of view in terms of existing infrastructure, existing energy policies, will make it more and more difficult to achieve the kinds of emission reduction targets that we are looking for. Remember, 44 tons by 2020, but that was just to set the stage for further cuts that will be needed to 40 gigatons by 2025, 35 gigatons by 2030, and 22 gigatons by 2050. At the moment, the trend is in the opposite direction. We are at over 50 gigatons, and therefore what we are opening up here is not only an issue of gap in emissions, it is a set of public policy choices that are highly ethical in terms of, if you want, deferring action and imposing on future generations, taxpayers, young people, pensioners, the public at large, but also industry, costs that will be so much more difficult to meet. Because a further deferral of action basically means much higher rates of global emission reductions would have to be achieved in the medium term. We lock in carbon-intensive infrastructure that sometimes will have a life cycle of 20, 30 years. And therefore also the difficulties of trying to address how we would move into low-carbon infrastructure if these, let's say for the next 5 years, infrastructure investments take place under the current premise. We will have a greater dependence on technologies that are not yet proven. We will have greater costs of mitigation in the medium and long term, and we will, as many scientists already say today, face a greater risk of failing to achieve that threshold of staying below the 2-degree targets. I will stop here because my colleagues will in a moment present to you the more detailed findings. But I think as the world prepares once again to go towards a conference of the parties, as we move towards the end of the year 2013, and as we look also to the year 2015, when in essence the anticipation is that we would reach a new agreement on how to address globally and collectively the challenge of global warming, the news that this report provides is a very sobering perspective of where we are and where we are still heading, and quite how far-reaching the implications are of maintaining this trajectory that we see at the moment. None of this should hide the fact that across the world, more and more countries, more and more communities, societies, industries, local authorities are in fact beginning to act on climate change. The question is, are they all going to remain pioneers who have to do this on their own, or will we be able to frame through greater tightening of the pledges, through additional actions, through international voluntary actions that are complementary and can add momentum, can we actually make that gap become one that we can reduce rather than enlarge? Thank you very much, and back to you in Berlin.
Yes, thank you, Achim Steiner, for your statement from Nairobi. The date of publishing this report is well thought out, since next week the climate change conference of parties in Warsaw is running from next Monday on. And now the next one is Johann Flasper, the president from the Federal Environment Agency in Germany, with his statement.
Yes, first of all, good morning to Nairobi, to Achim and Nick Nuttall. We're just talking with each other. To be honest, we are a little bit jealous to see the sun in the background in Nairobi. We have agreed that I, in my statement, will address the media here in Berlin in German. Meine Damen und Herren, das Umweltprogramm der Vereinten Nationen hat mit diesem Gap Report, Lückenbericht, einen weiteren Bericht der jährlichen Analysen vorgelegt, wie weit wir zwischen den notwendigen Treibhausgasreduktionen bis zum Jahr 2020 und den derzeit vereinbarten, zugesagten und erwartbaren Treibhausgasreduktionen bis 2020 liegen werden. Diese Zusagen basieren im Wesentlichen auf dem Kopenhagen-Akkord, also der Vereinbarung 2009 in Kopenhagen, freiwillige Zusagen zu machen, in welchem Umfang die Staaten ihre Treibhausgasemissionen senken werden. Und von diesem Startpunkt aus hat UNEP es dankenswerterweise übernommen, zu analysieren, was denn an Lücke übrig bleibt, um die eigentlich erforderlichen Reduktionen zu erreichen. Was man insgesamt sagen kann, dieser Bericht von UNEP ist ein weiterer Weckruf für die Staatengemeinschaft, ihre Ambitionen im Klimaschutz zu erhöhen. Gerade eine Woche bevor die Klimakonferenz in Kopenhagen starten wird. Es ist absolut evident nach dem letzten IPCC-Bericht und nach dem, was UNEP jetzt analysiert hat, dass der Klimaschutz das größte globale Umweltproblem ist, das wir derzeit haben und das im Zentrum jeder nationalen und internationalen Umweltpolitik stehen muss. Die zentrale Botschaft dieses Berichts ist alarmierend. Die derzeitige Geschwindigkeit im Klimaschutz, so heißt es in dem Bericht, ist schlicht unzureichend. Die bisherigen Zusagen reichen nicht aus und die Umsetzung dieser Zusagen reichen nicht aus, um das Ziel zu erreichen, bis 2020 die globalen Treibhausgasemissionen auf 44 Gigatonnen CO2-Äquivalente zurückzuführen. Achim Steiner hat es eben schon gesagt, wir liegen auf den letzten gesichert verfügbaren Zahlen für 2010 bei etwas über 50 Gigatonnen CO2-Äquivalente. Wir wissen aus Schätzungen, dass auch nach 2010 bis 2012 die Emissionen weiter gestiegen sind, zuletzt mit etwas geringerer Geschwindigkeit. Das ist sozusagen die leicht positive Zwischenbotschaft, aber sie sind weiter gestiegen und in einem Business-as-usual-Szenario würden wir bei 59 Gigatonnen im Jahre 2020 landen. Das ist erkennbar eine große Lücke zu dem, was erforderlich wäre. UNEP hat mit den Wissenschaftlern aus vielen Ländern, aus vielen Studiengruppen nun verschiedene Szenarien untersucht und im Wesentlichen dabei geschaut, wie es wäre, wenn die bereits gemachten Zusagen unterschiedlich ambitioniert umgesetzt würden, so will ich es mal ausdrücken. Das bedeutet einmal, ob man strikte oder weniger strikte Regeln bei der Umsetzung anwendet. Das soll heißen, würden wir überschüssige Emissionen beispielsweise aus der ersten Kyoto-Verpflichtungsperiode anrechnen, dann wäre das eine weniger strikte Anwendung der Regeln und das würde logischerweise zu geringeren Emissionseinsparungen führen. Das Zweite ist, es gibt konditionierte und unkonditionierte Zusagen. Das kann man gut in Europa sehen. In Deutschland gibt es ein unkonditioniertes Regierungsziel, die Emissionen bis 2020 um 40% gegenüber 1990 zu senken. In Europa gibt es, ich muss sagen, leider ein konditioniertes Ziel, nämlich 30% Reduktion, wenn andere Industrieregionen ähnlich ambitionierte Ziele festlegen und ansonsten eben nur 20%. Und der Bericht sagt, dass wenn wir also an allen Stellschrauben drehen, auf der Basis der bisherigen Zusagen, wir die Lücke etwas verkleinern können, um einige Gigatonnen auf 52 Gigatonnen insgesamt, dann wäre die Lücke also noch 8 Gigatonnen. Es bleibt also noch eine Notwendigkeit, weitere zusätzliche Anstrengungen zu unternehmen. Und auch da zeigt der Bericht Möglichkeiten auf, natürlich weitere Zusagen, erhöhte Zusagen, aber es gibt auch konkrete Aussagen, wie wir im Bereich internationaler Kooperation, das ist eigentlich der Schlüsselbegriff dieses Berichtes, verstärkte internationale Kooperation, beispielsweise im Bereich Energieeffizienz, Hier wird beispielhaft die Enlighten-Initiative von UNEP gezeigt, also die Umstellung auf energiesparende Beleuchtungssysteme weltweit mit einem großen Potenzial, aber auch die verstärkten Initiativen im Bereich Erneuerbare. Ich darf erinnern an die Initiative von Bundesminister Altmaier zum Erneuerbaren Energienclub, also verstärkte Ambitionen in diesem Bereich. Ganz zentral, auch aus Sicht unserer nationalen Behörde, des Umweltbundesamtes, der Subventionsabbau im Bereich fossiler Energien, mit dem wir sehr viel an Einsparungen erreichen könnten. Und es wird auch der Bereich Agrar adressiert. Warum ist das Jahr 2020 so wichtig? Es ist nicht so, dass wir mit einem späteren stärkeren Engagement im Klimaschutz das 2-Grad-Ziel nicht mehr erreichen könnten. Das sagt der Bericht sehr deutlich. Aber es wird, und das deckt sich mit den Studien, die das Umweltbundesamt beispielsweise beim Potsdam-Institut in Auftrag gegeben hat, aber es wird sehr viel teurer, wenn wir später unsere Ambitionen erst erhöhen. Also spätere Aktivitäten sind immer teurer als die früheren. Das 2020-Ziel mit 44 Gigatonnen ist ein kostenoptimaler, optimierter Weg. Und wir verlieren an technischen Optionen. Auch das hatten wir kürzlich hier in Berlin zusammen mit Ottmar Edenhofer vom PIC vorgestellt. Man wird dann auf bestimmte Technologien, wie beispielsweise Biomasse, CCS, weniger gut oder weniger leicht verzichten können, als wenn man früher startet. Was bedeutet das nun abschließend für nationale und internationale Politiken? Zunächst mal für Deutschland. Es ist gut, dass wir ein nationales Klimaschutzziel unkonditioniert haben, 40%, und Deutschland sollte dieses Ziel weiter mit großer Anstrengung verfolgen. Es ist möglich, dieses zu erreichen, aber es ist auch kein Spaziergang, das erfordert zusätzliche Anstrengungen. Zweitens, wir brauchen eine Revitalisierung der europäischen Klimaschutzpolitik. Die Diskussionen gestern bei den Koalitionsverhandlungen in Deutschland haben dazu ein ermutigendes Zeichen gesetzt. Es ist vereinbart worden, dass das Backloading im europäischen Emissionshandel von Deutschland künftig unterstützt wird. Wie Sie wissen, war das in den letzten 1,5 Jahren nicht der Fall. Und insofern ist auch gut die positive Reaktion von Conny Hedegaard gestern auf Twitter zu verstehen, dass sie hierin ein sehr positives Signal sieht. Als Leiter des Umweltbundesamtes muss ich allerdings sagen, wenn es nur beim Backloading bliebe, wäre das nicht ausreichend. Das muss ein erster Schritt hin zu einem zu einer langfristigen, robusten Reform des Emissionshandels werden, auch um anschlussfähig zu sein zu anderen Emissionshandelssystemen in der Welt. Wir sollten aus Sicht des UBA, wir müssten das konditionierte Ziel Europas, das ist ja einer der Punkte, die adressiert sind, von 20% auf 30% unkonditioniert erhöhen. Und wir brauchen mehr internationale Kooperation. Hier sind die Verhandlungen bei ICAO zum Luftverkehr zu nennen, aber auch verstärkte internationale Kooperation, wie beispielsweise bei der Bekämpfung kurzlebiger Klimagase, eine Aktivität, in der UNEP auch sehr engagiert ist. Abschließend will ich noch mal sagen, dass es sehr, sehr wichtig ist zu verstehen, dass wir bis 2020 auf der Basis freiwilliger Aktivitäten national und international vorankommen müssen, weil wir bis zu diesem Zeitpunkt noch nicht über einen internationalen Klimavertrag verfügen werden. Und ab 2020, so wie Achim Steiner es gesagt hat, wird dann der hoffentlich 2015 zu vereinbarende Klimavertrag wirksam werden und dann den Anschluss übernehmen.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Flassbart, for your assessment and also mentioning first field of actions for emission mitigation. Now we go more into details of the report, and I say welcome to Joseph Alcamo, who is the chief scientist at the UNEP and also mainly responsible for that report. And he will give more details to the key findings of that report.
Thank you very much. I'd like to take responsibility for the report, but I could never do this kind of work myself. And in fact, it was based on participation of 70 scientists from 44 different scientific groups from around the world, in 17 different countries. UNEP played an important role here as being the convener of the science. And what I'm going to tell you now are some of the highlights from the report, but it's a message from the science community to the policy-making community. So it's been 3 years since Cancun. How time flies. And at that very important climate conference in 2010, the countries of the world formally agreed to the so-called 2-degree target. They formally agreed that they would work together to hold the increase in global temperature to 2 degrees relative to pre-industrial, relative to the time when it began increasing because of human intervention. So of course the question arose immediately, how are we going to get there? And the scientists have come back with an answer. And it's actually an answer that doesn't surprise you. They say we have a carbon budget, just like we have a household budget. We have a certain amount of carbon dioxide or equivalent carbon dioxide that we can emit over a period of time if you want to stay within the 2-degree target. And like a household budget, you can spend a lot now. You can keep emissions very high and then in exchange have it much lower later. Or you can keep emissions lower now and they could be a little bit higher later. It all comes down to a budget and how you want to spend it. So they have used their computer models and they've told us, keeping in mind this budget, keeping in mind this target, then what are the pathways of emissions that we can follow over the coming decades? If they're a little bit higher now, then they'll have to be a little bit lower later, etc. And they've literally produced this curve here. This upper blue curve shows the whole set of curves. In fact, now there's more than 100 different scenarios produced by scientific groups all around the world, and we've aggregated them together, and they show in this cascade what the range of possibilities are if you stay within that cascade, that you will meet the 2-degree target within the period over the coming decades. Now, what does this set of curves tell us? Well, right now we're at 49, now closer to 50 gigatons. It says that these curves indicate or suggest that global emissions have to peak already by around 2020. That by 2030, as Achim Steiner already said, we need to be around a quarter below current global emissions. And by 2050, to take an intermediate value, we have to be more than 50% below current values. So these give us an idea from the science community what we need to aim for if we want to meet our own target of 2 degrees. Now, also back in Cancun, beginning in Copenhagen, but then formalized in Cancun, they agreed on a bunch of pledges. We would voluntarily reduce, and they all made a pledge. And the developing countries since have submitted plans. They haven't said it's so strong as a pledge, but we now have plans to control the increase in emissions. Altogether, nearly 100 countries have come together and said, by 2020, we're going to work hard to try and slow down the increase of emissions or actually reduce the amount of emissions. So that's up to 2020. So the question is, if this is where we need to aim for, then how does this compare to where we're headed according to those pledges? So what we're going to look at is that square, that rectangle in the upper left there, which gives us a closer picture of what the trends are between 2010 and 2020. And that's shown here. So these are the global emissions of total greenhouse gases from 2010 to 2050. Again, we're at around 49 now, or 50 gigatons. Where do we need to head? Well, an intermediate value right in that cascade there is around 44. That's that number that you heard that Jochen Flassbart has already talked about and many people talk about. So we're around 49 or 50. We need to head for 44. If we do absolutely nothing, if we even ignore the pledges, just as a reference point, we go in the exact opposite direction, up to 59 by 2020. But the good news is that countries have made pledges. So the scientists in this study have added up the pledges, looked at their implications. It's not so clear what the implications are. So we created 4 different cases by which the pledges would be implemented. And they're shown here. But still, they're going in the wrong direction, aren't they? They're more between 52 and 56, but still, they're pretty far from 44. And the difference we call the gap. Now, without these pledges, the gap would be really large. It would be 15 gigatons. With these pledges, it's still pretty large. That's 8 to 12 gigatons in 2020. 12 is a big number. That's about 80% of all the greenhouse gas emissions coming from all the power plants in the world right now. So under the least ambitious case, if the countries don't work very hard, we expect a gap of 12. And the conclusion is that the pledges simply are not enough to meet the 2-degree target, to be on a pathway, at least a least cost pathway. What I want to say is that these scenarios all assume very reasonably that we would stay within the 2-degree target by reducing emissions, but we would do it the most cheaply way possible. We would take the least expensive emission reductions now, energy efficiency in certain sectors, for example, or shifting fuels, and then we would go to the more expensive ones. That's the big picture that this diagram gives us. Under those assumptions, the pledges don't look like they would be enough to close the gap to where we need to be in 2020 to be on a pathway to comply with our own target, our own 2-degree target. Now, what's going to happen if we don't close the gap? Is the world going to come to an end? Not quite. First of all, if countries simply don't increase their pledges and don't act more rigorously later, then we'll be on a different trajectory. Not the trajectory to 2 degrees, but probably much higher than that, maybe even double 2 degrees if we don't act rigorously afterwards. What's another possibility? Let's say we don't do much more now than what we plan to do with the pledges. And then we decide, oops, we do in fact want to stay within our target, and we start hurrying in the 2020s to catch up. Now, since our last study, there have been many scientific studies of the consequences of this so-called later action. And what the scientists have found, which is documented in this report, are first of all, and as Achim Steiner already pointed out to you, first of all, if we're going to start later, we're going to have to bring down emissions really, really fast, probably twice as fast as we would have to if we were to begin emission reductions now. Secondly, we're going to have to bring down emission reductions so much we may even have to create what's called negative emissions. We may actually have to literally take more greenhouse gases out of the air than we put in a particular year. It sounds like science fiction, but it's not. In fact, there's some concepts called bioenergy plus carbon capture and storage, where on paper at least, and now in a prototype phase, you can, in principle, achieve negative emissions. But if we were to wait later to close the gap, we would become more and more dependent upon these kinds of technologies if we then want to still stay within the 2-degree limit. The scientists are telling us they haven't agreed on how much extra it's going to cost, but they say very clearly, according to all of their studies, if we begin later in closing the gap, then it's going to cost us more overall. Another thing, it's going to be higher risks. Apart from relying on these technologies more, we are going to be letting greenhouse gas emissions go and continue to be pumped into the atmosphere until we begin to reduce them in the 2020s, and that is going to let climate change continue at a higher tempo than it would otherwise, along with climate risks. Just a couple of weeks ago, IPCC told us that already in the world, there's a discernible increase in the amount of heat waves in cities in many, many different parts of the world, especially Europe and Asia. It's something that they take out of the data. And we would, in the meantime, also lock in high-emission technologies. We wouldn't have the fuel standards we would have otherwise. We'd be burning a lot of fuels in our automobiles that will still be on the road, burning a lot of fuels in our power plants that will still be in operation and not phased out. But what's the good news? How would we then bridge the gap? Well, here's some more numbers for you I'll go through quickly. I mentioned that with business as usual in 2020, we'd be at 59. In the weakest case of the pledges, we'd bring it down by 3. But since we want to be at around 44, that still leaves a big gap of around 12. How do we start to close this gap of 12? First of all, if we tighten up the rules that are being discussed with regard to the pledges, for example, whether surplus emission units from previous agreements could be used in this agreement, if we tighten up the rules, and if we move from the so-called unconditional to the conditional pledges, which the EU and other parties have made, then we could reduce this gap by around 4 gigatons. If we expand the scope of pledges, If we expand it to more gases, most countries are now talking about CO2 reductions, but if we also include HFCs and methane and other important greenhouse gases, and if we get more countries on board for even modest pledges, then it's possible to reduce it even further by another 2. That gives us 2 plus 4, that's 6. That halves the gap of 12. The remaining 6 needs to be closed and bridged by further national and international action. Now, in this report and past reports, we have pointed out that all around the world, on the ground, policies are reducing emissions, and in an intensive way. For example, in transportation, we found that the potential in 2020 is to reduce emissions relative to the business as usual by about 1.5 to 2.5 gigatons, a big amount. How? Through all kinds of different measures, like bus rapid transit systems. 16 countries have these kinds of systems, and just take Mexico City. They've been avoiding around 140,000 tons of greenhouse gases every year just by having a bus rapid transit system. In the building sector, there's a whole wide range of actions we could take. More than 75 countries have already adopted appliance standards and labels. And we found in our report that if we tighten up these standards and expand them to the rest of the world, we could save nearly 1 gigaton of emissions in 2020, just from ramping up appliance standards. In agriculture, which we focus on in this report, we found that the potential is enormous, 1 to 4 gigatons reductions in 2020. If the high end is true, then reductions in agriculture alone could account for closing 2/3 of that remaining gap in 2020. And how? By nothing very exotic, by advanced nutrient and water management in rice fields, by agroforestry, by conservation tillage. That is, moving away from plowing fields to seeding your crops in a different kind of way. Now, a lot of countries have been doing conservation tillage for years. Argentina has been doing it since the 90s, and we compute in our report that since the 90s, they have avoided around 100 million tons of greenhouse gas just by shifting from conventional tillage to conservation tillage. Now, the thing is that a lot of these actions have been done not for climate mitigation, but in fact to further national and local interests. Mexico City really didn't design its, I don't think so anyway, their bus rapid transit system to bring down greenhouse gases. They're proud that they did, but they did it to reduce traffic congestion and reduce air pollution in Mexico City. Countries have adopted appliance standards in order to save energy costs at home, and conservation tillage can reduce a lot of fuel costs from plowing. So they're done for local and national benefits, but at the same time they achieve real emission reductions. Now, there's also possibilities for international cooperation, with Jochen Flassbart has already mentioned, and one of my colleagues will mention more, but there's a whole variety of different international cooperative initiatives, the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, the Clean Energy Ministerial, many of which Germany is a part of, which are working not within the climate negotiations, but are complementing the climate negotiations by working in different sectors to bring down emissions for a variety of different reasons. It could be to save energy costs, as the Clean Energy Ministerial is doing, but at the same time, these are certainly contributing to slowing down the increase in emissions, and not all of them overlap with the pledges that the countries have made, so they're actually helping to close the gap. There's many different areas where they have a high potential to achieve reductions in the area of energy efficiency, of renewable energy, of fossil fuel subsidy reform, etc. Many possibilities in which these initiatives can make progress in complementing negotiations to close the gap. So, to sum up, it's urgent to bridge the emissions gap of 8 to 12 if indeed we want to stay on a least cost pathway to meet the 2-degree target. By not doing that, it's going to cost us a lot more, and we're going to take a lot more risks having to do with putting our dependence on technologies and letting climate change proceed at a higher tempo than it would otherwise. It's going to be very tough to close this gap, but it will be possible. The scientists that put together this report believe it is still feasible to close the gap by strengthening country pledges and ramping up other national and international actions.
Thank you, Mr. Alcamo, for analyzing the different gap scenarios and giving positive examples for action. We we'll now have two short editions, one from Niklas Höhne. He's Director of Energy and Climate Policy at EcoFIS, and he's Associate Professor in the Netherlands at Wageningen University. He just will highlight what is really new to the last report. Please, it's your fault.
Thank you very much. I'm one of the 70 authors that contributed to this report. It's the fourth time that we are doing this. And one important question is definitely what's new in this report. And I want to highlight three elements that are new this year. One, we are analyzing what countries have put forward internationally in their pledges. And actually, their pledges have not significantly changed since 2009. So these pledges are the same, more or less. A few changed, but that's very minor. But what has changed last year in Doha, at the last climate conference, that there had been agreement on the accounting rules. And that had an impact on our lenient accounting cases. There was a decision that emission allowances that were able to be used, that came from the Kyoto Protocol first commitment period, and there was a question whether these can be used in the future, and the decision was that only a very limited amount can be used, and that had a difference of 1 gigaton in our calculations compared to last year. So that shows that international decisions at the international level can also help to close the gap. Second change from last year is that in this year's report we have a chapter on the international cooperative initiatives. And they were mentioned before. We see that many entities, states, but also non-state actors, are taking action that have an effect on greenhouse gas emissions. And often climate is not necessarily the primary driver for these activities. And these activities are complementary what national governments are putting forward, and they can help close the gap. And in this chapter this year, in this year's report, we looked at several reports that try to highlight in which areas and under which conditions these complementary initiatives can help. And we identified, or we highlight here 4 areas where most of the reports agree, where more can be done, where there's already significant activity, and where there is, in most cases, a positive or neutral effect on the economy. And those are, 1, energy efficiency, where already a lot is happening. Second one was fossil fuel subsidy reform, where quite a lot of public resources are spent on not reducing emissions, but rather increasing the emissions. Then another area we highlighted is methane and other short-lived climate pollutants. And the last area is that on renewable energy. So there's significant agreement that in these areas more action can be implemented in the short term by a variety of actors. And the third thing that is new this time is that we not only looked at the pledges of the countries, we also assessed the national policies that countries have implemented to see whether they are on track of meeting their pledges. And I think we find there that there is significant policy activity happening, not sufficient yet, we still see a gap, but there's significant policy making underway, and if all of that is materializing in the future, then there's still hope that the gap is closed. Let me give you some examples. For example, countries that are covering 2/3 of global emissions, 2/3 of global emissions have nationally binding climate laws or a politically binding climate strategy. So the national policy implementation has increased significantly over the last years. Another example is over 100 countries have renewable energy targets. A third example would be that emission trading systems are being designed all over the world, most notably China, which has pilot systems, or California or South Korea is developing a system. And a last example is countries are committing themselves to phase out inefficient lighting, and over 40 countries have committed to phase out inefficient lighting. So we see here that there's significant policy-making activity on the way, and that can definitely contribute to closing the gap. Ja, für deutschsprachige Medien bin ich nach der Pressekonferenz auch noch, stehe ich zur Verfügung für Fragen. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Höhne. We came now to the last edition from Monica Araya. She is Executive Director of Nuvala. That's a think tank from middle-income countries. This is also the perspective she's taking in, and she will give us some examples what these countries can do on the domestic level.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Nairobi. I am from Costa Rica, for those of you who don't know that, and I used to be a negotiator for my country. The report has very strong and clear messages, and therefore the question is, can these messages make a difference at home? So what I'd like to emphasize today is that unless we connect this discussion on climate action to local political debates, the emissions gap will continue increasing. Only when we connect our mitigation imperative to local politics, that is elections, and decisions made by our Congress, will we see a game changer in our climate actions this decade. So one of the key challenges for my generation is to stop treating climate change as an environmental issue only. In order to close the gap, we will need to influence not only ministries of environment, but the critical economic choices that cabinets make as a whole. It is therefore imperative for all of us to expand the boundaries of this debate that we're having on the climate crisis so that we tackle the imperative challenge that we face in the 21st century. What is it that we need to invest in and why? What is the kind of infrastructure that is able to sustain development without increasing emissions? And while it is urgent, critical, and welcome to invest in renewable energy and energy efficiency, these green investments alone will not be sufficient to close the emission gap. Critical to our effort to close the gap is for us to collect our courage and start saying no to the many wrong decisions that we're making by default. In particular, this means saying no to high emissions infrastructure. Because today politicians, especially in developing countries, and my country is no exception, are promoting infrastructure of the last century in the name of development, and often without much public debate. And that is precisely the very difficult conversation that we have to have and we're not having. Let's face it, we need to say no in the traditional political debates, and we need to stop treating fossil fuel dependency as inevitable. We have to raise the question on what is the opportunity cost of keeping our investments in the high carbon economy. And let me just start by saying something about younger voters. My country is facing an election in a few months. And it will be younger people who will define the election in my country. And I don't think that is only a Costa Rican phenomenon. They do not believe in traditional politicians anymore. They don't even believe in the traditional media. They have stopped reading newspapers. And I know you come from the media, and perhaps that is not necessarily a discussion that I will bring right now. But my point is that social media in a lot of developing countries is the platform where younger people are bringing new ideas to the climate discussion. And this has implications for us who are talking about the gap and the emissions imperative, because we have to find a way of communicating what this challenge means for the new generation. And I see this as a challenge, but also an opportunity. And what I'd like to emphasize is that unless we connect the debate on emissions, climate, energy choices to the broader question of what is the kind of countries we want to build, we're not going to make a difference. So with that, I'd like to finish by saying that my own contribution will be to work together with people from other middle-income economies and to put on very concrete ideas for not only for the policy-making debate and what to do, but to the political debate on what to do, but how and why. Thank you.
Yes, thank you to all on the panel for your statements and explanations. And now the floor is to the journalists. You can help with your questions. Please identify yourself when you make your questions. Und Sie können natürlich auch die Fragen auf Deutsch stellen.
Or Spanish.
Oder auch Spanisch. Okay, please. Who is the first? We have at the moment no question via social media, so we can start here. Frau Lehmer, bitte.
I think I ask in English. If you look at the developments, especially in Africa, where many countries are at the brink of becoming oil exploring countries or gas exploiting countries, do you really see that in-lock of the fossil system is breaking apart? That is the fun question I have. And the second question is, if I look at, I mean, the questions Mrs. Araya was putting on the table are very much questions on developed countries too. If I look at the case of Norway, which has a not so bad record when it comes to climate action, it depends completely on oil. That is a problem which is not even addressed in Norwegian politics. We have the same problem in the German politics. We are still depending very much on coal, and the coal issue is still the hottest issue to discuss in our current policies. So how do you think these things can come together? I mean, on the one hand, we are trying to say to others the future will be renewable. On the other hand, we are really fighting to keep our fossil system. So how do you think we can come in a conversation where these deadlocks in the discussions can be at least addressed?
Who wants to answer?
I can say that from where I live in Kenya, the situation indeed does look like they are interested in developing their oil resources, as are their neighbors in East Africa. And at the same time, there's quite an enormous amount of action in exploiting both geothermal and wind energy right now. There's an enormous capacity that's being planned. Let's put it this way. It could go either way. Certainly, I'm not resigned to the fact that Africa and developing countries have decided already to go down the fossil fuel path. They argue that they should be entitled to exploit some of their resources, but then, on the other hand, OECD countries have the opportunity to both transfer knowledge and do training to make them aware of the opportunities for geothermal, solar. I can't think of a part of the world where solar energy works better than Africa, for example, and wind energy at the same time.
I can add something. I can give you a quick example from my country. Basically, we are considering taking a loan to build a refinery, an oil refinery from China. And the way I've seen this debate can bring you new allies is by putting on the table the opportunity cost of using $1,500 million for an oil refinery, when at the same time we could be making these investments in clean energy and specifically clean transport. And you just have to link it to a debate about democracy. Why is it that we are going to take a loan that all Costa Ricans will have to pay in order to build an oil refinery? Just ask the question. And you will see a lot of economists and progressive people coming to the conversation, not necessarily from the climate community only, but from the broader, the broader sectors that want to have a say on what is the kind of countries we want. And I do think that to the extent you open the conversation about how to make choices, who makes the choices, then you have a bigger, stronger, and more courageous debate that will actually put the old infrastructure in a pretty bad light.
Mr. Flasper wants to add?
Yes, 3 short points. First one is, yes, you mentioned Africa, but also you will find in the report that Africa will be one of the regions of the world who will be most heavily attacked by climate change, and that the cost of adaptation will run up to 350 billion US dollars in the second half of the century. And of course there are different ways to address this, and I've visited Nigeria in spring this year, And this is a perfect example where you can see the two pathways. Of course, they have the oil and they have the gas, but this country will only be able to provide its citizens in the land, in the countryside with energy if they will go along off-grid solutions with renewables. So there are options, and it's also part of the responsibility of international cooperation to highlight options as an alternative to the fossil way. And the second one is on, as you addressed, national policies and the dependency on fossil energy. I mean, it's a different whether you are dependent on fossil energy or you have the feeling to be dependent on fossil energy, and that is exactly what we have at the moment in the focus of our debate in Germany. That it is, of course, economically and also socially not so easy to leave the old pathways and to enter new ones. But we are on our way.
Mr. Steiner, you want to add?
Yes, I think the question is extremely important because in pure numerical terms, the world needs to first of all acknowledge that if trading in oil, gas and coal is a legal global market, then there is no reason whatsoever why an African country should not join this market, which is one reason why those who argue that, you know, let us just see what happens with renewable energy and low carbon economies, countries are beginning to act on their own, will very soon hit the point where if you want to begin to acknowledge that there is, as the first graph that Joel Camo showed, a certain carbon budget, then as the head of the International Energy Agency also pointed out, sooner or later, quite a number of the reserves that we already know today of oil, for instance, will not anymore be pumped out and brought into the economy, because the world will start setting absolute limits. But for now, there is no reason for Africa not to explore its oil. Secondly, let us acknowledge that in the next 20 to 30 years, Africa will try to provide electricity to 70 to 80% of its population that still has no access to electricity today. If Africa is by default forced to go down the fossil fuel path, you are adding an entire China economy to the global carbon budget, to the global oil and gas markets, in just the next 20 to 30 years, because that is the population of Africa today, over 1 billion people. Africa is trying already, with great courage and also initiative, to go down a renewable path. The question is, where is the technology and finance support? You have already, last year, a significant increase in renewable energy investments in Africa. It's shot up from 2 billion to 12 billion. You have just had the largest wind power farm being inaugurated in Ethiopia. You have major investments in Kenya with green energy tariffs and a green energy policy. You have a major initiative in South Africa, both in renewable energy, energy efficiency. Ghana, Morocco. These are countries who are trying to choose the 21st century path towards energy. The question will be, how will they domestically be able to find the resources, but how will also international climate policy and financing either enable them to make that transition faster or to be locked into using fossil fuels as the cheap technology available today. And I think this is a good example where international cooperation, a global climate policy, and also a global climate agreement are actually essential for countries such as those on the African continent. Thanks.
We take the next question. Next question, please. Please identify yourself.
Good morning. Wolfgang Pomsen is my name, Telepolis, Internet magazine. Well, first a question, a more global question. If we look at the budget, then what comes to my mind is that different countries use this budget in a very different way. That is, that Germany is emitting something like, I don't know, 10 tons CO2 equivalents per year and head of population. Other countries just 1 ton. So my question is, where's equity? Where comes equity into all this, what we discussed today? So the second question is more special to Jochen Flassbart concerning German policy, and for convenience I will do it in German. Herr Flassbart, wenn ich das richtig sehe, das deutsche Ziel 40% bis 2020 bringt uns ja auch noch lange nicht zu dem, wo wir eigentlich hin müssen. Also was wäre eigentlich der nächste Schritt, den es Uber für nötig hält bis 2030, sage ich mal? A, B, meine Frage, auch dieses 40%-Ziel bis 2020 ist ja alles andere als sicher bei der gegenwärtigen Politik. Was müsste konkret passieren in Deutschland, damit dieses 40%-Ziel auch tatsächlich erreicht wird? Passen da neue Kohlekraftwerke rein und neue Braunkohletagebäume? Danke.
So we start with the question concerning equity. Who wants to answer on that?
Achim vielleicht, oder?
Mr. Steiner, you want to answer on that?
Yeah, I can also say a few things.
If I may just pick up briefly on the equity, I would suggest that it is fundamental to the whole negotiations. And the reason why we are struggling so much in the global climate negotiations that 193 nations with different carbon budgets, different historical legacies, and different opportunities to choose different pathways are trying to find a formula for the 21st century of how 7-8 billion people can equitably address the low carbon pathway. So yes, the contradictions that you point to are there, but they are the reality. What we are trying to identify increasingly, and it is also what Ms. Araya was pointing to, is that in trying to resolve the equity issue, we should not only look at the costs of transition, and I think this is what you will see over the next 12 to 24 months increasingly taking center stage. It is opportunities, it is the benefits that also to nations, for example, such as Kenya, that become independent of global fossil fuel markets because they have domestic energy resources, because they can actually avoid pollution and 4 to 6 million premature deaths per which are associated with that according to the WHO. The economics of investing in a transition towards a low-carbon economy is defined both by equity in the negotiating arena, but also by economics and opportunity in the domestic national interest. And I think this is going to be the heartland over which we will work over the next 24 months towards 2015.
Just a very quick
please,
response. Clearly, that is the essence of why the negotiations are so difficult. And I was part of that process myself. And what I can tell you is that we have moved from a very black and white conversation, if you will, because in the past and for many decades, or many years, sorry, the conversation or the big discussion was what is fair when it comes to developed and developing countries. But if you really look at what's going on right now with the negotiations, you realize that an even more complicated question is what is fair within the developing world? Because clearly a country like Malawi and a country like China or India or Brazil or even my own country will have a very different responsibility. And I do think that that has been a question that you never saw being discussed in the negotiations before, because 10 years ago, the default answer was only developed countries have the obligation to reduce emissions, and there was this kind of approach that didn't really make it possible for us as negotiators to say, actually, developing countries are part of the problem as well. So there is a sentence that I like very much. No country is too big or too small to be part of the solution. And what you will see in the road to 2015 is more courageous approaches so that every single country has a legally binding target. And the second point, and my final point, is that when it comes to equity, the question is not only what to do now that is fair for us, people who are alive. I think the broader and even more complicated question is what is fair and equitable vis-a-vis people who haven't been born. And that is one aspect of the equity debate that we really, really need to bring to the fore, the intergenerational aspect.
Yes, now the two questions to Mr. Flassbart to the national climate targets.
Well, in addition to the equity issue, I want just to say that I believe the time of the old-fashioned time of finger pointing is over. If you look at the figures, you now have 60%, close to 60% of the emissions coming from developing countries. If you look at the historical emissions, it's more or less equity between both of them. If you look at the per capita, you surely have the differences, and that is we have to work on. But the key word for the future is collaboration. Yes, of course, still common and differentiated activities, but collaboration is key to achieve the global targets. Und zu den Fragen, die Sie auf Deutsch gestellt haben. Ich finde, Deutschland muss sich überhaupt nicht verstecken. Wir haben ein 40%-Ziel, 40% Treibhausgasreduktion. Das ist, soweit ich es sehe, eines der ambitioniertesten Ziele, die wir weltweit in Industrieländern haben. Und wenn Sie dazu nehmen, dass wir gleichzeitig entschieden haben, aus der Atomenergie auszusteigen, ist es definitiv das ambitionierteste Klimaschutzziel, das es weltweit in einem Industrieland gibt. Und ich finde, das ist eine sehr positive Entwicklung. Wir sind noch nicht, wenn Sie das hochrechnen auf 2020, bei den 40% mit den jetzt vereinbarten Maßnahmen. Wir liegen irgendwo bei 33, 34% Zielerreichung perspektivisch. Das heißt, es ist auch in Deutschland zusätzliche Ambitionen erforderlich. Das wird umso leichter, wenn wir auch in Europa ein höheres Ziel haben, weil dann auch der Emissionshandelssektor in Deutschland voll mit einbezogen werden kann in die Minderung. Es geht aber auch ohne. Es wird nur anstrengender. Dann müssen wir mehr in der Gebäudesanierung tun, dann muss man mehr im Verkehrssektor tun, ein Bereich, in dem man relativ schnell in Deutschland als Politiker relativ einsam ist und wenig Freunde hat. Aber es geht natürlich auch in diesem Bereich noch deutlich mehr. Perspektivisch liegt Deutschland, wenn wir in Europa 80 bis 95% erreichen wollen, sicherlich im Bereich der 95%. Wir haben kürzlich dargelegt, dass das geht, technisch geht, auf unserer Conference on Greenhouse Neutral Societies. Das bedeutet dann Zwischenschritte von jeweils 20 Prozentpunkte pro Dekade. Das kann man leicht ausrechnen. 40% 2020, 60% 2030, 80% 2040 und dann 95%.
I continue with a question from the BBC from Matt McGrath, who asked via Twitter. He's asked, can you speak to the issue of agriculture and the impact on emissions reduction by 2020?
Sure. One very interesting finding we came up with in our report is that there's actually very large potential to reduce emissions in agriculture, which just the direct emissions alone from agriculture, that is the amount of nitrous oxide that comes up from applying fertilizer or the carbon dioxide that comes from plowing fields, etc., just that alone accounts for more than 10% of total global emissions right now. So there's opportunities there, but what's interesting, then the potential we've estimated is around 1 to 4 gigatons. So that's those are big numbers. If you're able to achieve the upper end of those emission reduction potentials, around 4, that would account for 2/3 of that remaining gap that I talked about after the negotiations, after strengthening the pledges. The remaining gap would be around 6 gigatons in 2020, and agriculture, with a lot of investments and a lot of action, could actually help to close about 2/3 of that gap. And it's not with anything very exotic. It has to do with increasing the way in which we apply fertilizers to our fields, do it in a more intelligent way so that there's not huge nitrogen losses that lead to, among other things, nitrous oxide emissions, which is a very powerful greenhouse gas. It has to do with, I was talking about conservation tillage, so that you don't plow the fields very rigorously, and that allows the carbon in the soil to break up and leads to carbon dioxide emissions. So actually, with a whole series of measures that we look at, that the scientists look at in our report, you could not only bring these emissions under control and help to close the gap, but at the same time you could take a big step down the pathway of sustainable agriculture, in which even poor farmers can manage their fields such that they require less fertilizer and get higher yields. In the end, if it's done right, you could actually increase the profits among the smallholders and do something about rural poverty. It depends on how you do it, but certainly you can unite ideas about sustainable agriculture for the whole world together with ideas about controlling emissions already by 2020.
Any further comments to that question? So that's not the case. So we continue here in the room, please. Mr. Very behind. Bitte sagen Sie auch nochmal Ihren Namen.
My name is Roland. I'm an agricultural journalist from Germany, freelancer. Yesterday there was a discussion in the Committee of Environment in the European Parliament promoting CCS technology. From your point of view, what are the pros and cons about CCS?
Who wants to answer that? Mr.
Go ahead.
We've seen in these scenarios that go to 2 degrees or limit temperature increase to 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees, that some of these models are indeed using large shares of CCS technology, in particular in combination with biomass, because that kind of technology then would help to take emissions out of the atmosphere. So some of these models rely on that kind of technology, which has indeed pros and cons. It is a technology that has not been implemented at large scale, but there are some test sites going on. There are other scenarios that are going for very low emissions that are also trying not to rely on CCS. And also there we see scenarios that is possible. So there are scenarios out there that go for 100% renewable energy, global energy supply, and they find that that is possible as well. So definitely it is one of the technologies that can be part of the mix, but it does not, well, necessarily have to be. The later we start with emission reductions, the more we rely on these kinds of technologies, because, as we've heard, the budget is fixed. More emissions today means a lot less emissions in the future, or even negative emissions. So the later we start with the reductions, the more we rely on that kind of technology.
Achim Steiner, please.
Yes, I think it's a very good example of what the report was speaking to, which is technologies are hypothetically available. The question is, are they economically deployable? Are they viable? And as you just heard, maybe in a few years' time, by measure of desperation, we will invest significantly in carbon capture and storage technology because we do not have alternatives. But today, the economics is still very challenging for CCS. Indeed, Norway has just taken a decision to not proceed with one of its pilot plants. It is something that we have to keep our attention on, and we should never dismiss it, but it is precisely what the report means. The minute we have to begin to deploy technologies that the market simply cannot sustain, it is the taxpayer who will have to step in with very significant investments. And here again is the notion that we have available through the climate negotiations is also one where we have drawn attention to how this planet has captured and stored carbon over millennia. It is the ecosystems, the world's oceans, the world's forests, and again, we have, through the climate negotiations, even though we don't have a global agreement, given rise to a whole new mechanism called RED and RED+, which is trying to incentivize what is a much cheaper form of carbon capture and storage today if we can expand ecosystems again, forests, in order to provide the planet with some of that storage capacity. And let me also mention, since you are from the agriculture world, one of the things that we're also drawing attention to is again and again and again the term efficiency, efficiency, efficiency. Today, more than 1/3 of everything that we use nitrous oxide for, that we use carbon fuels for, soils, water, in terms of food production, is actually lost and wasted. 1/3 of everything that contributes to the carbon footprint of agriculture. That is why also a campaign of FAO and UNEP and many others on Think, Eat, Save is another pathway in which citizens can be part of lowering the carbon trajectory. And I think what we have to remind people time and again is that every consumption choice, every day of every individual on this planet adds up to a lot, and therefore can also add up in terms of a lot of changing direction. Thank you.
I continue with the next question via Twitter. It's Edward King from the British web magazine RTCC, responding to climate change. He says last year's emissions gap study is virtually the same. Time for a new tactic from UNEP, maybe focusing on more positive things. That's what he asks and suggests. Mr. Alcamo.
Well, it took an awful long time to put out the same thing, I have to tell you. So actually, if you look at it and read it, it has quite a lot of new material. Actually, it should look somewhat the same because we were asked by countries a couple of years ago, please provide us with an update, given the amount of scientific research of whether this gap concept, what part of it is still valid, what part of it can we still use, and tell us how we're doing with closing it or not. So it's intentional that part of our report each year goes over the same territory to give an update to countries because they've requested it. That being said, each year also we look at some ways of closing the gap. This year we've done an analysis of these international cooperative initiatives. As Nicholas Höhne said, who's one of the co-authors of that chapter, there's great opportunities for those parallel initiatives outside of the negotiation process to enhance emission reductions. At the same time, we also looked at agriculture and other sectors to look at what the opportunities there. So I think each year we're going to inform you again of how we're doing with regard to the gap. There's always a little bit of drama in it as we go through the numbers. And at the same time, try and keep you informed about new opportunities to close the gap. Next year, by the way, we are going to be addressing a very critical issue, which is going to be reaching the table more and more, and that is, if you don't close the gap, then what about adaptation? We've referred to it obliquely today. It comes up every time when you talk about the costs of closing the gap. Well, what we reply is, certainly you could save those costs, but save them for adaptation. Because if you don't stay within the 2-degree target, then you will have a higher temperature increase, greater changes in rainfall patterns, and certainly greater impacts that you have to adapt to. UNEP has just put out a report on adaptation in Africa. And what we found, interestingly, is that if you don't comply with the 2-degree target, if you exceed the 2-degree target, and we've said in this report that it could mean 3 or 4 degrees globally, much higher locally, if you don't comply with the 2-degree target, it could cost you $150 billion more per year in Africa to adapt to those higher changes. So we have to think of it again in terms of a budget. If you don't want to spend the money now for mitigation, you'll end up spending it later for adaptation. It goes one way or the other. So look forward next year to something entirely new, which provisionally we're calling the Adaptation Gap Report.
No, thank you for this forecast. I don't see any questions here. There's one question. Okay, one last question, please.
Hello, good morning. Juan Palop from the Spanish news agency, FM. I would like to get some input from the panelists regarding their expectations from climate conference next week in Warschau.
Who looks at that conference next week in Warschau? Mr. Steiner, please.
Well, let me just briefly say that in Warsaw, I think the critical test that everybody will apply is whether the roadmap towards 2015 can be agreed. And that may sound strange to the general public, but governments do need to agree on how they will begin to negotiate different elements and different packages, because a lot depends on synchronicity in these negotiations. We have some fairly significant disagreements still in the room as to precisely how governments wish to plan and choreograph, if you want, the different negotiation steps. Secondly, I think you will also see in Warsaw an assessment of what will happen between now and 2020. Because as Jochen Flassbart pointed out at the beginning, whatever happens, by 2015, what you will have is an agreement that only begins to become legally or comes alive, legally speaking, in 2020. We have 7 years between today and 2020. Can governments agree on a number of actions voluntarily? And how would those, for instance, be counted towards the future. You've heard about it before. This is a very important issue, because if it's not counted, then maybe governments have a perverse incentive not to do anything until 2020, while if things that will be done between now and 2020 will be counted towards a country's contributions in terms of its pledges, you may actually see an acceleration of actions even when the legally binding agreement or framework has not kicked in yet. And here also voluntary initiatives and best practices will play a key role. And let me not forget to mention that, you know, one of the big questions in the room also is, how will the Green Climate Fund evolve? Financing and technology still remain critical elements in the international negotiation dynamic. And again, Warsaw will have to give some pointers in terms of what are the next steps here. But I'll leave it to others to address this. And I just wish to excuse myself because I have another engagement next door. So thank you very much to you in Berlin and to journalists all over the world for being interested, and to the panelists. Jochen, thank you very much for hosting the Pressekonferenz. Thank you, colleagues.
Anybody else who want to add a short comment to that?
Yeah, very quickly, because Achim touched upon key issues. I think you will see a big push from developing countries who will want more clarity from developed countries on their targets for finance, and because it's a negotiation, we don't expect anyone to put on the table exactly the final number. You know, it's just the way it is. So I think what a lot of developing countries will argue is that at least key developed countries will have to give some credible signals that there will be finance available. And a lot of that communication effort is very critical, especially for the countries that are doing things already. So they don't want to move to a world where climate finance will be in a limbo. So that aspect, you will see a lot of that in the next 2 weeks.
Thank you so far. There are no other questions, also no questions on Twitter now, so we can close this pre-event for today. Thank you very much for the participation here, and thank you to everybody who has prepared this international press event.